You have done it tonight. Maybe you are doing it right now. Lying in the dark or sitting in the quiet of a room that finally belongs only to you, running through a conversation that has not happened yet. You are choosing the right words, feeling out the pauses, preparing for the moment the other person says something you did not expect, and then pivoting, adjusting, building a new path through the dialogue in real time, inside your own mind. And then you do it again, a slightly different version, a better opening, a calmer tone of voice. You rehearse it until it feels safe enough to actually have. Most people, if they knew you did this, would call it overthinking. They would say you worry too much, that you need to relax, that not everything has to be so complicated. But what they do not understand, what they have perhaps never had to understand, is that for you, this is not anxiety for the sake of anxiety. This is a system. This is something your mind built, quietly and efficiently, at an age when you had no other tools available, and it has been running ever since. You are not broken. You were once a child who did something extraordinary to survive, and the part of you that rehearses every conversation before it happens, that part is not a flaw. It is the oldest, most loyal architect inside you, still doing the job it was trained to do, long after the original danger has passed. There is a specific kind of person who lives this way. They tend to be perceptive in rooms full of noise. They notice the slight shift in someone's expression before that person has even registered it themselves. They feel the temperature of a conversation change before a single difficult word has been spoken. They are the ones who, when asked a question in a group setting, do not just answer it. They first consider how the answer will land, who it might affect, whether this is the right moment, whether their voice will sound too eager or too flat or too much. They calculate all of this in the space of a breath, and then they speak, and no one in the room has any idea how much just happened. This is not social anxiety in the clinical sense, though it can overlap with it. This is something more architectural. This is the result of a nervous system that was taught very early that the wrong word at the wrong moment had consequences. Real consequences, not hypothetical ones. To understand why, we need to go somewhere that most conversations about anxiety never go. We need to talk about what happens to a child who grows up in an environment where emotional unpredictability is the norm, where a parent's mood determines the weather inside the house, where saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, in the wrong tone, could cause a rupture, a punishment, a withdrawal of love, or simply the heavy, suffocating silence of a disappointed adult. In those homes, children do not get to just talk. They learn to perform. They learn to read the room before they enter it. They learn that words are not just expressions, they are instruments, and that an instrument played carelessly can cause a great deal of damage. Psychologists call this hypervigilance. It is one of the core adaptations of a child who has experienced emotional inconsistency or relational unpredictability. The brain, in its profound intelligence, begins to devote significant resources to threat detection. Not physical threats necessarily, but social and emotional ones. The shift in a parent's breathing, the particular silence that means something is wrong, the way a door closes that tells you tonight, will require careful navigation. The child's nervous system begins to run constant background scans, processing the environment for signals that most adults would never even consciously register. And in doing so, it becomes extraordinarily skilled, almost supernaturally attuned. Dr. Stephen Porges, a neuroscientist whose work on polyvagal theory has quietly reshaped how we understand human behavior, describes the nervous system not as a simple on-off switch between safety and danger, but as a sophisticated hierarchy of responses. At the top of this hierarchy is what he calls the social engagement system, the capacity to connect, to feel ease in the presence of others, to speak and listen from a place of genuine openness. Below that sits the fight or flight response, the mobilized state of defense, and below that, the deepest and oldest layer, is the shutdown response, the freeze, the withdrawal, the going very quiet inside. What Porges discovered is that our nervous systems are always unconsciously assessing the environment for cues of safety or threat. He calls this neuroception, and the critical insight is this. When a child's neuroception is calibrated in an environment where other people are unpredictable, where connection sometimes leads to pain, the nervous system begins to experience solitude, not as loneliness, but as regulation, as safety, as the only place where the background noise of constant threat assessment finally goes quiet. This is why the person who rehearses every conversation is often also the person who feels most alive, most themselves, most at peace when they are alone. It is not misanthropy. It is not coldness. It is the nervous system returning to the only environment in which it learned it could fully exhale. But let us stay with the rehearsal itself for a moment, because it is worth examining with real care. When you replay a future conversation in your mind, when you run through every possible version of how it might go, you are doing something that cognitive scientists recognize as mental simulation. You are using your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning and prediction, to pre-experience a social event. This is something all humans do to some degree, but in people with a history of relational unpredictability, this process is not occasional. It is constant. It is the default mode. And here is what is important to understand. It is not irrational. In fact, in the environment in which it was developed, it was an exceptionally rational strategy. If you could predict how a conversation would go, you could prepare for the worst version of it. You could have your response ready. You could reduce the window of vulnerability, the moment between stimulus and response, in which something could go wrong. You were not overthinking. You were stress testing your reality before you had to live in it. That is not a weakness. That is a form of cognitive sophistication that most people never develop because they never needed to. The psychological term that circles closest to this experience is something called pseudo-maturity, sometimes discussed under the broader framework of parentification. Parentification occurs when a child, consciously or not, takes on responsibilities that belong to adults. Emotional responsibilities, the job of managing a parent's feelings, of keeping the peace, of being the one who reads the room and adjusts accordingly so that everyone else can be comfortable. These children do not get to be children in the full sense. They skip directly into a kind of miniature adulthood, one that looks, from the outside, like maturity, like being wise beyond your years, like being so responsible. But it is not maturity. It is survival wearing maturity's clothes. And one of the most consistent legacies of this experience is the rehearsal. Because when your emotional survival depended on saying the right thing, you became an expert at preparing to say the right thing. You became your own speechwriter, your own director, your own audience. You learned to anticipate, to adjust, to script, to revise. And you became very, very good at it. The cost, of course, is exhaustion. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes not from doing too much, but from simulating too much, from living in potential futures before you have finished living in the present one, from carrying the weight of conversations that have not yet happened and may never happen exactly as you imagined them. This is the quiet tax that hypervigilant minds pay, and most people around them never see it, because from the outside, this person seems composed, prepared, thoughtful. They always know what to say. They never seem caught off guard. What no one sees is that they have been preparing for this moment for the last 3 days. There is another dimension to this that rarely gets discussed, and it is the relationship between the rehearsal and something psychologists call the external locus of evaluation. When we grow up in environments where our emotional safety depended on how others responded to us, we learn to outsource our sense of self to external feedback. We become fluent in reading other people's reactions and using those reactions to determine our own value. Did they seem pleased? Did they seem disappointed? Were they quiet after I said that? The rehearsal is, in part, an attempt to control those reactions before they happen, to engineer the feedback, to ensure that when the moment comes, we will be received well, and therefore, we will be okay. The humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers described the internal locus of evaluation as the capacity to judge your own experience, your own thoughts, your own worth, from the inside out, rather than from the outside in, to feel the validity of your own perception without needing it confirmed by someone else's expression. For the person who rehearses every conversation, this internal locus is not absent. It is simply buried beneath layers of learned performance. It has been waiting, patiently, for permission to speak. And this is where something begins to shift. Because there comes a point, often quietly, sometimes in the middle of the night, during yet another rehearsal, where you begin to notice the rehearsal itself, where you step outside the simulation and watch yourself running it. And in that moment of observation, something changes. You are no longer just the actor inside the script. You are also the author watching the actor. And the author, unlike the actor, has a choice. This is the beginning of what we might call the architect's perspective. It is the moment when the question shifts from "why am I like this?" to "what is this actually doing for me? And what would I like it to do instead?" Because the capacity that drives the rehearsal, the attunement, the precision, the ability to anticipate and simulate and prepare, that capacity is not the problem. It is one of the most extraordinary gifts a human nervous system can develop. The question is simply who it is in service of. Is it in service of an old fear? The fear of a child who needed to manage everyone else's emotions to stay safe? Or can it be placed, consciously, in service of something chosen? The person who has lived this way tends to be among the most emotionally intelligent people in any room, not because they were born that way, but because they trained. Every conversation they rehearsed was a kind of empathy exercise. Every scenario they simulated required them to model another person's psychology, to anticipate how that person thinks and feels and reacts. They developed a theory of mind so sophisticated that they can often understand what someone else is experiencing before that person has fully understood it themselves. This is not a small thing. This is the foundation of great leadership, great art, great counsel, great love. But it must be turned inward, at least some of the time. The same precision you use to understand others must be offered to yourself. The same patience you extend to the imaginary versions of other people in your rehearsals must be available for the real version of you, the one who is tired, the one who has been preparing for everything for a very long time, the one who deserves a conversation that does not need to be rehearsed first. There is a distinction worth dwelling in between solitude and loneliness. They feel similar from the outside, and sometimes they get confused even from the inside, but they are profoundly different in their nature. Loneliness is the ache of absence. It is the feeling of being disconnected from something you need. It is the hunger of a self that has been too long without genuine contact. Solitude, true solitude, is not the absence of connection. It is the presence of peace. It is the experience of being with yourself without the noise of performance or the weight of other people's expectations pressing in. It is the room where the rehearsal finally stops, and you are simply here, simply you, without an audience, without a script. For people who have spent their lives reading rooms and managing impressions and preparing for every possible version of every possible conversation, genuine solitude can feel unfamiliar at first. It can feel uncomfortably quiet because the mind that has been trained to stay busy with simulation does not always know what to do with stillness. But stillness is not emptiness. Stillness is where the self that got set aside, the self that was too busy managing everything to simply exist, it is where that self begins to surface again. You do not have to earn this. You do not have to be more productive, more socially fluent, more emotionally available to others before you are allowed to rest inside yourself. The version of you that rehearses every conversation is not a version that needs to be fixed. It is a version that needs to be understood, honored for what it survived, and then gently, without force, invited to put the script down for a moment. You are allowed to speak without having prepared. You are allowed to not know how a conversation will go before you enter it. You are allowed to be surprised, even caught off guard, even imperfect in your response, and still be worthy of the connection you have been so carefully, so exhaustingly preparing for. The architecture of your mind was built with extraordinary care, but even the most brilliant architect eventually has to stop designing and simply live inside the space they have made. This is your permission, not to become someone different, not to perform ease you do not yet feel, but to rest, even briefly, from the rehearsal. To trust that who you are, unrehearsed, unpolished, simply present, is already enough. It always was.